War of the Worlds Retelling Chapter 14 Part 2. On Wellington Street, many people were reading and discussing pink sheets of paper. This caused a lot of noise and commotion, with sellers trying to get people to buy the papers. Even those who were not interested before were now excited about the news. Along the way to Trafalgar Square, my brother saw some people who were fleeing from West Surrey with their belongings in a cart. They looked tired and scared compared to the well-dressed people on the buses. Some fancy-looking people watched them from their cabs. The group of refugees were unsure of where to go and eventually decided to head east along the Strand. Behind them was a man riding an old-fashioned tricycle who looked very tired and dirty. My brother walked towards Victoria and met many people who were also fleeing. He hoped to find me among them but didn't. He saw that there were many police officers regulating traffic, which was unusual. Some of the refugees were talking to people on the buses and sharing stories about seeing the Martians, while others were just excited and energized by their strange experience. As they moved beyond Victoria, the pubs were filled with these new arrivals. People were gathered on street corners reading newspapers, talking excitedly, and staring at these unusual visitors. As the night went on, more and more people arrived until the roads were as busy as Epsom High Street on a Derby day. My brother tried to talk to some of the people, but most of them gave unsatisfactory answers. My brother asked many people for news about Woking, but no one knew anything except for one man. This man said that Woking had been completely destroyed the night before. The man explained that he was from Byfleet and had heard the news from a cyclist who had warned everyone in the early morning to leave the area. Then soldiers arrived and they saw clouds of smoke to the south, but no one was coming that way. They heard the sounds of guns from Chertsey and saw people coming from Weybridge. So he locked up his house and left. At that time, many people in the streets believed that the authorities were responsible for not being able to get rid of the invaders without causing so much trouble. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, people all over South London could hear the sound of heavy gunfire. My brother couldn't hear it clearly because of the loud traffic on the main roads, but he could hear it clearly by walking through quiet back streets to the river. He walked from Westminster to his apartments near Regent's Park, which took about 2 hours. He was very worried about me and upset by the extent of the trouble that was happening. His mind was focused on military details, just like mine was on Surrey. He thought about all the silent guns waiting for action and the sudden movement of people from the countryside. He even tried to imagine boilers on stilts that were 100 feet tall. There were some refugees passing through Oxford Street and Marylebone Road, but the news had not yet spread widely. People were still walking and talking in the streets as usual. It was a warm and quiet night, but the sound of guns could be heard intermittently, and there was lightning in the south after midnight. The narrator's brother was worried about the situation and read the newspaper repeatedly. He tried to distract himself but couldn't, and eventually went to bed after midnight. He was woken up later by the sound of commotion in the streets, knocking, running feet, drumming, and bells ringing. The room was lit up by red reflections, and for a moment he was confused about what was happening. Then he got up and went to the window to see what was going on. He was staying in an attic room. When he looked out of the window, he heard many people shouting and saw many heads poking out of windows. A police officer banged on his door and shouted that the Martians were coming. The Albany Street barracks made loud noises with their drums and trumpets, and nearby churches rang their bells loudly. People in the houses across the street turned on their lights and opened their doors and windows. He saw a closed carriage and a couple of cabs galloping up the street, making a lot of noise as they went by. Many more vehicles followed, heading towards Chalk Farm Station to catch the Northwestern special trains instead of going to Euston. For a long time, my brother looked out of the window and was very surprised. He saw policemen knocking on door after door and shouting something that he didn't understand. Then, the man who lived across the hall came into his room. He was only wearing a shirt, pants, slippers, and his suspenders were hanging loose. His hair was messy from sleeping. The man asked, "What's going on? Is there a fire? What's with all the noise?" They both leaned out of the window to try and hear what the policemen were shouting. Other people from nearby streets were coming out and gathering in groups on the corners, talking amongst themselves. "What's happening?" the man asked my brother again. My brother didn't know what to say, so he just kept getting dressed, running back to the window every time he put on a new piece of clothing so that he wouldn't miss anything. Suddenly, some men came shouting into the street, selling newspapers that were unusually early. The message was spreading throughout London that there was a great danger of suffocation, and the defenses at Kingston and Richmond had been breached. There were reports of terrible killings in the Thames Valley. In every direction, people were waking up and looking out of their windows, trying to figure out what was going on. They were getting dressed in a hurry, feeling the fear that was spreading through the city. This was the beginning of a great panic. London had been completely unaware of the danger when it went to bed on Sunday night, but it was now fully awake to the threat in the early hours of Monday morning. My brother couldn't see what was happening from his window, so he went outside into the street. It was early in the morning and the sky was turning pink. There were lots of people running and driving around, and they were all shouting black smoke. This made my brother scared too. He saw a man selling newspapers and bought one for a shilling. The man was running away while selling the papers, which seemed strange and scary. My brother read a newspaper and found out that the commander-in-chief had sent a terrible message. The Martians could release large clouds of poisonous smoke with their rockets. They had destroyed several places and were moving towards London, destroying everything on their path. It was impossible to stop them, and the only way to survive was to flee immediately. The people of London were starting to panic and run away. People were shouting black smoke and fire. The church bells were ringing loudly, and a careless driver crashed into a water trough, causing chaos. The houses had flickering lights, and some of the passing cabs had their lights on. The dawn was getting brighter, clear, and calm. My brother heard footsteps running around in the rooms and upstairs. His landlady came to the door in her dressing gown and shawl, and her husband followed, both looking worried. As my brother started to understand what was happening, he quickly went back to his room, grabbed all his available money, which was around £10, put it in his pockets, and went out into the streets again.